In the dead of night, with visibility nearly zero and the runway lights as their only guide, Ares Flight 8250 approached San Andres. After a 4-hour delay and battling bad weather en route, the crew anticipated that only one final landing stood between them and the end of a long day. But the pilots were unaware of the danger hidden in the darkness. Believing they were safe above their intended path, they unknowingly descended too low, falling victim to the infamous black hole illusion. This disorienting phenomenon, where the darkness plays tricks on even the most experienced pilots, combined with the bad weather, led them into a deadly trap, making them think they were on course when in reality, disaster was seconds away. Can the pilots land this aircraft safely, or will it end in tragedy at the very last moment? This is the story of Ares Flight 8250. On the early morning of August 16, 2010, Ares Flight 8250, a Boeing 737-700 registered as -4,682 Hong Kong dollars, was preparing for a scheduled domestic passenger flight from Bogota to San Andres Island, Colombia. Initially, the flight was scheduled to depart on August 15 at 9:29 p.m. However, a delay message was sent, revising the estimated departure time to 10:50 p.m., and later another delay pushed the departure to 11:45 p.m. After a long wait, 125 passengers, a mix of tourists and locals, boarded the aircraft. The passengers included Colombian nationals and individuals from the United States, France, Brazil, Costa Rica, and Germany. The crew for this flight consisted of 4 cabin crew members and 2 pilots. Captain Wilson Gutierrez, an experienced pilot with over 7,600 flight hours primarily on turboprop aircraft, had recently transitioned to the Boeing 737 and was serving as the pilot flying for this journey. First Officer Camilo Galvan, who had around 1,900 flight hours, was his co-pilot and served as the pilot monitoring. At 11:25 p.m., the flight crew contacted El Dorado Ground Control, confirming the new estimated departure time. The ground controller cleared the flight for its journey to San Andres, and the pilots acknowledged this. With the engine started, the flight crew called back to ground control to request taxi instructions to runway 31 right. A few minutes later, the aircraft was pushed back from the gate and began its taxi toward the runway, where it waited for clearance to take off. At 7 minutes past 12 a.m. local time, more than 3 hours behind schedule, Flight 8250 took off from El Dorado International Airport, marking the start of a new day. The aircraft climbed steadily toward its cruising altitude, and the initial phase of the flight was uneventful. The pilots maintained regular communication with air traffic control, passing through different control zones without issue. The atmosphere on board was typical of a night flight, with passengers settling in, some preparing to sleep and others engaging in light conversation. The flight from Bogota to San Andres typically takes about an hour and 40 minutes. The route crosses the Andes Mountains and the Colombian Plains before reaching the Caribbean Sea. The final approach involves a descent over the ocean towards San Andres Island. At 1 a.m. local time, about 45 minutes before landing, the captain conducted the approach briefing with the first officer. During the briefing, they reviewed all critical aspects of the approach, including the weather conditions, planned route, landing runway, navigation aids, altitudes, and any potential issues that might arise. Following the briefing, the captain programmed the Giga 3 Alpha arrival and the VOR Zulu approach for runway 06 at San Andres Airport into the aircraft's flight management system. San Andres Airport is known for its single runway, which is 2,380 m long and 36 m wide. The approach to runway 06 is particularly challenging due to the surrounding terrain, and a nighttime approach to the island can be especially tricky, with no visible difference between land and water and only the runway lights as a visual reference. The airport has various landing systems, including a VOR/DME system. This navigation procedure uses the VOR or VHF omnidirectional range beacon and DME, the distance measuring equipment, to guide the aircraft. The VOR emits signals to help pilots determine their position, while the DME provides distance readings to ensure proper altitude adjustments during descent. After completing the approach briefing and noting the worsening weather conditions discussed, Captain Gutierrez requested a deviation of 8 to 10 miles to the right to avoid the worst of the storm. For the next 20 minutes, the flight proceeded without any notable events. At 1:25 a.m., the flight crew requested clearance to begin their descent. Panama Control initially approved a descent to 20,000 feet but soon adjusted this, limiting the descent to 24,000 feet. Concerned by the worsening weather, which was evident on the radar, the captain requested an updated weather report. The tower reported that runway 06 was in use with calm wind, visibility over 10 kilometers, broken clouds at 1,500 feet, and a temperature of 30 degrees Celsius. The tower also reported stormy weather near the airport, but without any rain. At 48 miles from San Andres, Panama Control cleared the aircraft to descend further and handed them over to San Andres Control. As they continued their descent, the weather significantly worsened, leading to increased turbulence and growing concern among the passengers. The flight attendants reassured the passengers that the weather would soon improve. Meanwhile, the pilots requested direct routing to the Giga waypoint from San Andres and were cleared to proceed, descending further to 3,000 feet for the VOR Zulu approach to runway 06. The approach begins at a waypoint called Giga, 12 nautical miles from the VOR/DME station. At 3,000 feet here, the aircraft follows a course of 067 degree, descending on a 5.2% gradient toward the final approach fix, located 5.9 nautical miles from the VOR/DME station at 1,600 feet at the final approach fix. The aircraft should be fully configured for landing, with landing gear down, flaps set, and speed stabilized. From here, the descent continues to 630 feet above sea level. If the runway is visible by this point, the pilots proceed to land. However, if it is not, they maintain their altitude until they reach the missed approach point, located 0.9 nautical miles from the VOR/DME station. If it is still not in sight by then, the pilots initiate a missed approach procedure. This carefully coordinated approach ensures the aircraft follows a safe and precise path, even in challenging weather conditions. At 1:40 a.m., just minutes before landing, the first officer lowered the landing gear, reactivated the autothrottle, and adjusted the flaps in preparation for landing. After reporting to the tower and receiving clearance to land on runway 06, the weather continued to worsen, with winds at 10 knots and heavy rain reducing invisibility to 5 kilometers. Minutes later, they set the flaps to the final configuration and completed the landing checklist. As if the weather wasn't bad enough, the tower updated the visibility to 4 kilometers with a wet runway and wind at 040 degree 8 knots. Upon visually confirming the runway, the captain disengaged the autopilot and took manual control of the aircraft. However, due to the poor visibility and minimal visual references, the pilots mistakenly believed they were higher than they were, leading them to fly too low on the approach. This misjudgment is characteristic of a black hole illusion, a visual illusion often experienced during night approaches over dark terrain. The contrast between the runway lights and the surrounding darkness misled the flight crew into thinking they were on the correct path, with the adverse weather conditions adding an extra layer of difficulty. Compounding this issue, the captain, who had recently transitioned from turboprop aircraft to the Boeing 737, applied a landing technique more suited to turboprops. He aimed to land precisely at the very start of the runway, a practice that leaves little room for error, particularly in a jet and especially under such stormy conditions. This approach, combined with their already low altitude, further reduced the margin for safety. At 500 feet above the ground proximity warning system announced 500 feet, and the captain acknowledged 500 checked. As the aircraft continued its descent, the weather conditions worsened even further. The captain requested intermittent mode for the windshield wipers, which the first officer activated. They faced severe turbulence and rapidly changing visibility. Despite these challenges, they continued with the landing attempt. However, the aircraft flew too low, making a normal landing seem unlikely. The ground proximity warning system issued alerts indicating dangerously low altitude. These warnings were critical, signaling the need for immediate corrective action, but they did not respond adequately. At 1:47 a.m., the aircraft impacted the ground 49 m short of the runway. The aircraft skidded along the tarmac, the landing gear collapsed as one engine ripped off the wing, and passengers and cabin crew were thrown through the cabin by the brutal impact. The aircraft slid more than 500 feet before coming to a halt, breaking into 3 parts and resulting in a catastrophic scene. Amidst the chaos, one of the flight attendants quickly opened the main door, allowing passengers to evacuate. In what can only be described as a miracle, nearly everyone on board managed to escape the aircraft, defying the odds and surviving what seemed like a certain death. The airport's emergency services responded swiftly, extinguishing the fire and evacuating the injured. Despite the crash's severity, the rescue team's prompt actions saved many lives. Nevertheless, The crash resulted in the loss of 2 lives and injuries to many others. The Colombian Civil Aviation Authority's investigation uncovered several significant factors contributing to the crash of Aries Flight 8250. Firstly, the severe weather played a crucial role, with thunderstorms and heavy rain creating highly demanding conditions for the approach. Analysis of the flight data recorder showed the aircraft consistently flew 50 to 300 feet below the glide slope indicated by the precision approach path indicators. This was partly due to a judgment error as the crew mistakenly believed they were higher than they were. This misjudgment, typical of a black hole illusion experienced during night approaches over dark terrain, was exacerbated by poor weather conditions. The contrast between the runway lights and the surrounding darkness misled the crew into thinking they were on the correct path. Moreover, the captain's extensive experience with turboprop aircraft influenced his handling of the Boeing 737. Unlike turboprops, which are more forgiving during landings, jets like the 737 require precise techniques. The captain's landing technique, mirroring that of a turboprop, highlighted a deficiency in his training for flying a large jet. A tragedy could still have been averted in the final moments had the crew reacted to the multiple alerts from the ground proximity warning system, which warned them of impending terrain. Pull up. Unfortunately, these warnings were not adequately addressed, reflecting a significant lapse in situational awareness and decision-making. Despite these clear and urgent alerts, the captain failed to take corrective action, even when the first officer instructed him to pull up. Although the flight crew had substantial flight experience, it was advised that additional training in handling non-precision approaches and adverse weather conditions could have been beneficial. The report recommended enhanced simulator training to replicate challenging scenarios, emphasizing the importance of strict adherence to approach procedures and the effective use of available technology. In response to these findings, the Colombian Civil Aviation Authority and Aries implemented several safety measures. These included revising training programs to focus on non-precision approaches and adverse weather operations, updating standard operating procedures, and enhancing flight simulators to replicate challenging approach scenarios. These steps aim to prevent similar accidents in the future and ensure that pilots are better prepared to handle adverse conditions. Don't forget to like and subscribe to my video. Thanks for watching my video.